right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Camden Conference community event. I'm Em. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library. We are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's event. Before we get started, I would like to briefly remind our Zoom audience that this talk will be recorded and archived to both the library's YouTube page and the Camden Conference website. So please keep your microphone off for the duration of the presentation. And there will be time for questions at the end of the talk, at which point you will be able to either unmute yourself and ask Paige a question directly, or if you prefer, if you're more comfortable, you can type it into the chat and our Camden Conference representative will read it aloud for you. And let me make sure that everyone's in from the waiting room. Perfect, looks good. All right, and I'm happy to turn it over to Nick Mills, who will be introducing tonight's speaker. And Nick, you go right ahead. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Em. And as Em said, my name is Nick Mills. And on behalf of the Camden Conference, welcome to this evening's program. And many thanks to the Rockland Public Library for making these community events possible. And thanks to Em for coordinating them so ably. If you're not already familiar with the Camden Conference, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum operating almost entirely on that green energy source called volunteer power. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on global issues. And as part of fulfilling that mission, we offer a series of community events leading up to our annual February conference. These events provide background for the conference and touch on areas that might not be covered in the conference itself. This year's Camden Conference, Europe Challenged at Home and Abroad, will be held on the last weekend of February. It'll be our 35th anniversary conference. And I wish I could say that it'll be held live at the Camden Opera House, our traditional venue, but alas, an acronym, COVID, and its stepchildren, Delta and Omicron, has caused us to go fully virtual for the second year in a row. We hope you'll join us from the comfort and safety of home. Before I introduce our speaker, a disclaimer. The views, opinions, and positions expressed by our presenters are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the Camden Conference. That bit of legalese dispensed with, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. Dr. Page Herrlinger is an associate professor of history at Bowdoin College, where she has taught since 1998. Her courses include modern Russia and the Soviet Union, Germany, 1918 to 1945, and the Holocaust. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Philosophical Society. She is currently co-director of an NEH summer seminar for middle and high school teachers, teaching the Holocaust through visual culture. Her topic this evening is Russia, Europe, and the Holocaust, History, Human Rights, and National Identity. Professor Page Herrlinger, welcome.
Thank you all very much. And I want to second all the, Nick, I won't repeat your list of thank yous, but just ditto here. And thank you all for coming out tonight. We've got the storm coming. We've obviously had, the commemoration of a different kind of storm a year ago, lots of different things going on. And I just want to say Happy New Year before we get started. So I'm going to try to share my screen here, and hopefully you will see my PowerPoint. Yes? Thumbs up? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to get right to it. So, news headlines about Russia have been particularly striking of late, especially from a human rights perspective, and one might add very discouraging, in fact. I suspect many of you are familiar with this individual, the lead opposition to Putin, Alexei Navalny, who has gone through quite a lot in the last year and a half, and is currently imprisoned. Perhaps less familiar to you is this man, a historian like myself, Yuri Demetrius, who is now serving a 13-year prison sentence for his work on Stalin's terror and the Gulag. He has also been a active with the Memorial group, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The prosecution of a historian is troubling, to say the least, but is part of a larger effort on the part of the Putin regime to minimize Stalinist crimes and to tarnish as quote unquote foreign agents. That's kind of a term like foreign spies. Those people who are working to uncover the many abuses of the Stalin era and commemorate the victims. And this is something that we've been seeing since about 2012, but more and more so since 2014. And then even more recently, as in about a week, 2 weeks ago, the Putin regime through the court system has shut down Memorial itself, which is, as many of you probably know, the most important human rights group, non-governmental human rights organization in Russia. It's been there since the glasnost era in the 80s. And if you aren't familiar with it, this gives you, I shot this from their website and have highlighted sort of some of the work that they do. And it's been absolutely critical to the recovery of historical memory in Russia, particularly around Stalinist repressions, but also to the rehabilitation of many individuals and their families. So the idea that they are now being shut down, and the pretense is that they did not properly observe the foreign agent laws, and that they have quote unquote justified terrorism and extremism because they call 400 individuals political prisoners instead of criminals, including people like Navalny. So, you know, the charges are not necessarily trumped up, but they are very suspicious. And what's really going on here is an attempt to silence the kind of work that they do. So that's obviously troubling from a human rights perspective. At the same time, though, Russia's record on Holocaust commemorations seems to be trending in a different direction, with greater attention given to the Holocaust in terms of education and commemoration than ever before. For example, as this slide suggests, Putin was an active supporter of the project to build a Jewish museum and cultural center in Moscow. This opened in 2012. He was working with the Russian chief rabbi, he's actually quite close to. And the thinking around this was the museum would not only educate new generations of Russians about Jewish life, but also about questions of tolerance and Russia's history as a multinational, multi-confessional society. Putin was so apparently, and this is maybe hearsay, but so moved by this idea that he actually donated a whole month of his own salary towards the creation of this museum. Along with that, now 2 years ago in January of 2020, he delivered a speech in Jerusalem, as you can see here, before the World Holocaust Forum. And I'm going to come back to that speech in a couple of minutes. But, oh, well, actually, I want to give you a few teasers here, and we're going to come back to it more later, in which he sounds actually very much like someone from outside of Russia, maybe even in Europe, right? Or the United States, denouncing Nazi crimes against the Jewish people, using the language of shame and even darkness. And as we, would probably like to hear, the idea that the memory of the Holocaust should serve as a lesson, but only if it remains fully intact. So sort of a call to history, a call to memory, and denouncing those who try to stand in that way, and a pledge apparently to join in the effort to keep the Holocaust very much a focal point of historical inquiry. So this would seem to be encouraging. And I'm going to come back to this in 1 second. Even more recently, and I tried to get more information about this, he stood up to, when asked by human rights activists about a rumor that the Ministry of Education was going to take January 27th, which you might know is the day of Holocaust remembrance throughout Europe, throughout the EU, take that off the calendar. He pushed back and said that he didn't know that that was happening, and he didn't support that, and reiterated that it is important to remember the victims of Nazism, including the atrocities against the Jewish people. So as I want to suggest here, there seem to be sort of two different things going on, and I want us to think about how they might be reconciled. How can these two trends, the kind of memorial line of thinking and then the Holocaust line, how can we square those together? So I'm going to be exploring, to do that, I'm going to be exploring Russia's record on Holocaust commemoration and education, and want to think a little bit about what it can tell us about not only Putin, but also questions of Russian national identity today and Russia's relationship to shared European values and practices. Okay, to do this, I want to go back in time to where it sort of all began, actually even a little bit before the 1930s, when prior to the signing of the pact between Russia, or between the Soviet Union and the Nazi regime, the non-aggression pact, Stalin's regime was actually very active in highlighting Nazi anti-Semitism and violence. Then with the signing of the pact, that stopped until, of course, June 22nd, 1941, when the Soviet Union again began publishing news about the atrocities in occupied Poland. And then in November 1942, which was the height of Stalingrad, the Supreme Soviet established what is listed here, the Extraordinary State Commission to investigate and establish Nazi war crimes. It was fully aware, the state was fully aware that it could be useful to its own interests to collect evidence, some of which in fact was fabricated, distorted, but much of which was not, in order to attract support for the war effort, both at home and abroad, particularly Western allies, right? And as I'm sure many of you know, Stalin was very interested in getting a second front opened as soon as possible. Okay, sorry, there we go. Nonetheless, even as they are collecting all of this evidence, we start to see the rewriting of the narrative of the Holocaust. And what you're looking at here is a page out of the official commission reports about the massacre at Babi Yar in German-occupied Kiev, right? This is September 1941. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just in case, once the Germans had occupied the city, they began to round up tens of thousands of the city's Jews and force them to undress, and then they were directed towards the edge of this ravine known as Babi Yar, and over the course of 2 days, beginning on September 29th, they were shot and left to die. After that, and again, this is over 33,000 people in 2 days. After that, the Nazis continued to use this site for mass murder throughout their occupation, including the murder of the Roma people and other ethnic minorities, prisoners of war, and even patients at a nearby psychiatric hospital. As they were forced to retreat with the Soviet army behind them in 1943, they began to exhume the bodies and to burn them in order to hide evidence of their atrocity. So this reporting was really important, and it's just that it existed at all. The Soviet Union is keeping track of this. But here's the interesting part. As you see here, there's rewriting going on, and I'm going to show you even more specifically, because I don't imagine all of you read Russian, but this is what they're doing. They're taking this initial draft report from 1943, which is very specific that it's Jewish people who are being murdered, and then it kind of softens it, it kind of washes it, and refers only to civilians, not specifically Jewish civilians. And this we'll see is sort of the beginning of a trend. Vasily Grossman, who was one of the most well-known wartime journalists for the journal Krasnaya Zvezda, also came back to Ukraine around that time to discover that the village where he had grown up and the surrounding villages were completely devoid of the Jewish population, including his own mother, in fact. But when he tried to report on this, after reporting faithfully for the Soviet government for years about the war, he was not allowed. A few years later, he and Ilya Ehrenberg went to publish the book that you see here on the right, the so-called Black Book, which is a collection of testimonies, letters, and diaries about the atrocities against the Jewish people. This was part of a Soviet American effort. And that book would also be suppressed in 1948 on the grounds that it seemed to suggest that the Germans had fought the Soviet Union with the sole purpose of destroying the Jewish people. Now, the historians Klaus Carlson points to three main concerns at work in Soviet efforts to subsume Jewish suffering and even Jewish heroism under this broader umbrella of Soviet suffering and Soviet heroism. The first concern was that the great Soviet victory against fascism would be muted if attention was directed towards the fate of the Jews. And in turn, this would deprive the Soviet Union of the legitimacy that it was to gain through that victory. Another concern was that it might result in charges against local populations who either collaborated or were in some sense responsible for the atrocities. Another concern was that the patriotism, the Soviet patriotism that had been stirred up by the war effort, had also brought out evidence of latent anti-Semitism or nationalism, radical nationalism, xenophobic rationalism. I would add another point to this, which is that I would imagine, and I need to look into this more, that another concern would have been that drawing attention to atrocities against the Jewish people might have spurred other ethnic groups who were the victims of violence, other civilians who were the victims of violence at the hands of Soviets, and there were many, particularly in Central Asia. It might draw attention to their cause as well. To be clear, the Soviet Union did not deny that the Holocaust happened. After all, the state had collected evidence to show that it had, but rather, especially after 1948, the state begins to pursue an active policy of silencing and suppressing information about it. And this would continue long after Stalin's death. History books would focus on the war as a collective experience with an emphasis on unity, sacrifice, and achievement. All Soviet citizens fought and died and won together, right? No distinctions. In fact, as the historian Nina Tumarkin has argued, the focus was on the unique suffering of the Soviet people, not the Jewish people. I'm sorry. I don't know where to slide. Anyway, I had a slide in there for you. Maybe it comes a little later. Anyway, she argues also that, this is a quote from her, like world Jewry's appeal to the 6 million Holocaust victims, the Soviet Union's purported 20 million war dead came to represent a set store of redemptive suffering that the Brezhnev regime especially, so that's from 1965 to 1982, would call upon again and again as evidence of the country's unique position in world history. Now, she admits that anti-Semitism partly explains this refusal to acknowledge Jewish suffering, but she points to an even more important explanatory factor. It's what she calls the, quote, psychological economy of suffering. Quote, the Germans had meted out to all the Soviet peoples a more horrible fate. To have granted to the Jewish people an equal, or even in terms of this logic, higher status on the pecking order of martyred nationalities would have vitiated somewhat the Soviet claims on behalf of their own victimization and was therefore impermissible. So even and this would mean this repression, this attempt to silence any efforts to focus specifically on Jewish suffering or the genocide of Jewish people, specifically in history books, in attempts to memorialize, commemorate, whatever, everything was suppressed. Nonetheless, particularly at the site of Babi Yar, Soviet Jews began agitating for a memorial pretty much right after the liberation of Kiev. It didn't make a difference to the state, but it certainly made a difference to them. By the time Khrushchev's in power, he not only refuses to erect a memorial, but decides to turn that same site into a sports complex and to build a dam nearby, as if to literally bury all the evidence. Within a year of that construction beginning, however, the dam burst, drowning the entire area in mud, both the population and the landscape. And I think I have a slide on it. There you go. 145 people officially were killed, but knowing Soviet statistics, it was probably higher. Was this just a coincidence? I don't know. In any event, it was that same year that this poem, this famous poem by Yevtushenko, is published, and draws attention to the fact that there is no monument over Babi Yar. And the fact that it was published can only be explained by the fact that it was the thaw, the period of the thaw under Khrushchev. And even then, I think the editor, it was at, I think, Literaturная Gazeta, it was actually fired for allowing this to be published. This would create a lot of ripples. Shostakovich would write his own work dedicated to Babi Yar. It really raised public attention around the massacre and around the fact that Jewish suffering was being silenced. In any case, as I said, as far as the state was concerned, nothing's going to happen for quite some time. It's not until 1976 that we finally see a monument at Babi Yar. Once again, there is no mention of the Jewish victims. The dedication reads only to the memory of Soviet residents, soldiers, and POWs who were shot at Babi Yar by the German occupiers. The monument itself is also pretty odd as a Holocaust memorial. It was created by the Ukrainian sculptor Mikhail Lysenko, and I originally was supposed to feature a Jewish family, but in the final stage of the project, that idea was ruled out, and instead we get these 11 heroic figures posed in Soviet monumental style, clearly meant to symbolize the brave Soviet people fighting against fascism, fighting and suffering, I should say, under fascism. There's a Red Army soldier in the middle, partisan, a wounded woman, a sailor, a mourning woman, and a young mother with her hands tied with barbed wire, nursing an infant. In other words, the statue evokes the viewer's sympathy for the human loss suffered during the war, but it does nothing to commemorate Jewish suffering in particular. Nonetheless, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the memorial would become a site for memorial services on September 29th from then on. And if you're wondering why it's 1976, what's significant about that? One theory is that it was a response to international criticism against the Brezhnev regime for failing to take seriously the Helsinki Accords. In other words, its poor record on observing religious and human rights, especially of national minorities. This would be the first, but certainly not the last attempt to use Holocaust memorialization as a way to position Russia more favorably in the global context. The bigger shift around Holocaust memory comes in the mid-1980s. This is true in much of Europe as well, but it's glasnost under Gorbachev, which really changes the relationship of people to their past. The publication in 1988 of Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fate was a game changer. However, as you can see from this textbook here, as transformative as glasnost was in terms of historical transparency, it was far from complete. And history textbooks continued to suppress the Jewish story, as in this example. Adding to this was the fact that, so much changing all at once and a huge exodus of much of the Soviet Jewish population over the coming years. The Holocaust was just really not front and center for most Soviet citizens at the time. So it's really not until the 90s, until the fall of the Soviet Union, that we start to see that space opening up within Russia for Holocaust remembrance and research. And what you're looking at now is a website today. Of course, there was no website in 1992. But this is an organization that was founded in that year, and it remains sort of the most important NGO in Russia today, dedicated to educating the population about the Holocaust, supporting research, conducting memorial services, but most of all, I would say education, as you can see here, promoting, teaching the topic in schools and universities. So this is a 90s phenomenon. Along with that, you start to see some sort of memorialization, as in this memorial synagogue that was finished in 1998. It becomes also a center of education to a certain extent, but there's also this memorialization at the same time. Now, this shift towards more remembrance in the 90s is in part a natural shift away from the Soviet past that many Russians experienced in the 90s. But I think it's also tied to the broader international context where Holocaust memory and memorialization was becoming more active and more widespread throughout Europe, especially for those post-Soviet countries that wanted to be taken seriously in the West. They understood that they needed to demonstrate sensitivity towards the Holocaust. Certainly some other states, the Baltic states in particular, were a little bit more concerned with this as they vied for inclusion in the EU, but nonetheless, this was sort of in the zeitgeist of the moment. Commemoration of the Holocaust was also, again, in part a reaction against growing nationalism and anti-Semitism in Russia in the 90s. It was, of course, a very challenging time for everyone economically, socially. And so once again, Jews became vulnerable as a scapegoat for a lot of the problems that Russians were facing. And among the members of the so-called far new right, the Holocaust was actually seen as a Jewish lie perpetrated in order to gain political and economic advantage at that time. And they're drawing on a traditional association of Jews and the revolution, right? And the revolution is very much out of favor at this time. In any case, by the late 1990s, it seemed that Holocaust education was expanding and there to stay. It was mostly the efforts of individual teachers rather than a state-endorsed initiative. But by 2003, there was an official attempt to make the Holocaust a compulsory topic in textbooks across the nation. Now, a lot of times this was really limited, and if a student wanted to learn more, they had to do it on their own, but there were now resources to do that. And of course, with the internet, that was increasing all the time. At the same time, we see a sort of unification of Holocaust commemoration practices throughout Europe. As Europe unified, the Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust was convened in 2000 to define a common framework for that in terms of remembrance, research, and education. This is the forerunner to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance today. And then, of course, in 2005 was when January 27th was designated by the UN to be a day of remembrance of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and racism. Now, Putin comes to power at the very end of the last century, the millennium. And when he did that, he seemed, at least at first, prepared to continue with this trend of expansion around Holocaust education and commemoration, or at least unable to, maybe even unwilling, but unable or unwilling to stop it. As the historian Ben Nathan suggested a few weeks ago in an article about the shutting down of Memorial, when Putin first came to power, he actually appeared to agree with the premise of that organization too. The idea that policies should be based on a deep analysis of facts and theories and views, that fearless and open discussion and conclusions were in the best interest of society as a whole. And as I said, he also seemed supportive of efforts to commemorate the Holocaust in kind of European style. He showed up at the 2005 commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, the 60th anniversary. And there he gave a speech, another speech, emphasizing the inhumanity of fascism, emphasizing the Holocaust, and the contrast with quote unquote humanitarian values and democratic traditions that had been associated with the course of European history. The Holocaust, he acknowledged, along, of course, with the other European heads of states, constitutes the absolute non-negotiable evil in European history. At the same time, though, Putin's understanding of acceptable Holocaust narratives seemed much in line with his own Soviet upbringing. Importantly, his speech still did not mention the Jewish identity of the victims and instead drew attention to the 600,000 Soviet soldiers who gave their lives in order to liberate Poland, and of course to the 27 million non-Jewish victims in the Soviet Union. He also demonstrated a willingness to instrumentalize the Holocaust for political reasons, specifically by warning against the more contemporary threat of terrorism, in this case, in the Russian case, Chechen terrorism. So under his watch, we can see two different trends in Russian Holocaust commemoration. On the one hand, an expansion of Russian scholarly, educational, and cultural attention, especially at the grassroots, not official level. And on the other hand, a continued unwillingness in official Russian memory practices to give a full account of the Holocaust. Now, with respect to the first trend, there has been a growing tendency to commemorate January 27th in Russia, starting particularly in 2016. It's not an official holiday, but there are a lot of events scheduled around that. And in 2015, Putin went to the Jewish Museum to honor the memory of the victims. It's also worth pointing out that, I'm going to skip that. It's also worth pointing out that that the museum that he supported, this museum of Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, takes a new approach to the Holocaust, highlighting, among other things, Jewish resistance. This new memorial you're seeing here is considered the first significant Holocaust memorial in Moscow. It was unveiled only 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, and Putin and Netanyahu were both there in attendance. But along with that, the exhibits of the museum focus on sort of Jewish heroism in particular. The story of the Jewish war effort in the Red Army and partisan movements are featured prominently. And you can see this large screen behind there with video testimonies of former fighters. They're complemented by a lot of letters and from Soviet Jews and photographs and personal papers who fought. This kind of attention to Jewish fighters, specifically Jewish fighters, would have been unheard of in the Soviet period. At the same time, the framing is still very Soviet in that Jews seem to be kind of simply inserted into the heroic Soviet story. For example, the introductory text of the display reads, "Like the entirety of the Soviet people, Jews participated in the defense of their motherland." So again, what, if anything, has really changed? To answer this, I think I'd like to go back to Putin's speech just recently, 2 years ago, the Holocaust speech in 2020, which was addressed to at least 3 major audiences: Israeli citizens, Russians, and Europeans. And it really seems to contain a little something for everyone. One thing it makes clear is that Putin believes that the Holocaust is territory that holds enormous benefit in terms of Russian patriotism, the strengthening and solidifying of its national identity, and the raising of its status vis-a-vis Europe, as long as the focus remains on the Soviets as liberators. January 27th, after all, is the day that Europeans have chosen to remember the victims, but Russia can just as legitimately remind everyone that it was the day that the Soviet army liberated Auschwitz and claim responsibility, justifiably again, for saving Europe from Nazism. Now, to be sure, in shifting the emphasis from the experience of the victims to the liberators, he necessarily shifts almost all the attention away from the Jewish victims. So really, in the scheme of things, the speech includes only the briefest nod to Jewish loss and suffering, as you see here. In effect, it decenters the Holocaust and recenters on the power of the Soviet army. Again, this isn't Holocaust denial exactly, but rather evidence that he does not seem to prioritize many of the lessons humanity might learn from the Holocaust, or see the history of the genocide of the Jewish people from a human rights-based perspective. In this respect, I think his own stated thoughts on the purpose of history as a practice are revealing. And my comments here are drawn mostly from the work of the historian Mark Adele, who refers to Putin as a history man, who actually apparently history was his favorite topic growing up, which is pretty telling in itself, because Soviet history was super dry and of course very ideological. But he has since taken time out to speak to professional historians and to make his thoughts on history more clear to us all. In a gathering in 2007, for example, he emphasized the importance of the humanities, indicating that history was an important means by which to transmit the, quote, best traditions and values of our national culture to the younger generation, unquote. Now, for him, this likely means, in terms of values, a number of things: courage, sacrifice, collective action, but also, and critically, toleration. Tolerance is in our blood, he claimed to the historians present. Supporting the idea of open inquiry and competing viewpoints, as opposed to the kind of official ideology he grew up with, he seems okay with that. He doesn't seem to see a contradiction between a plurality of views and a positive national Russian narrative, because quite frankly, he seems to truly believe that more historical facts are only going to show even more clearly how great Russia and Russians are. So more history means greater Russia. In other words, for him, studying history is a path to encouraging people to love their country on the one hand. But of course, at the same time, the underlying assumption is that those who don't love Russia's history or who are critical of it are either wrong or engaging in lies. At the same time, he does acknowledge there were some dark moments. He talks, for example, this is in a later meeting with historians, about the necessity of brutality during the war, saying it was necessary, and therefore we need to accept that. It's hard to know, he suggests, what would have happened if the state had been less brutal, like, say, for example, Tsar Nicholas II during the First World War. But what we do know is that it would have been catastrophic if the Soviets had lost the war. In other words, the ends seem to justify the means. Likewise, Putin suggests that the Hitler-Stalin Pact was necessary, again, because it happened and it made victory possible. Quote, time, this is Putin, time was necessary to modernize one's army and new weapon systems needed to be developed. To him, this line of argument is perfectly safe and clear, right? That serious, deep objective histories would only confirm what he believes to be true. But in fact, the evidence, particularly with respect to the pact, in no way actually suggests that he's right, which makes me see his position on history as one primarily of faith or ideology rather than a commitment to truth or objectivity. In any case, he seems to believe that history only is going to serve his cause. But he's also a good strategist, and he has a plan B. And by that, I mean in 2014, when he moved ahead with a new memory law, which had already been kicking around for some 6 years, which in effect criminalizes anyone who tells lies about the activities of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Now, this is a deliberately ambiguous standard that has naturally led to more self-censorship around anyone who might pursue history, much as the 2018 memory law in Poland has done. A lot of people are self-silencing rather than risking being arrested or fined or called to task. In contrast to Holocaust denial laws, which are of course widespread in Europe, those outlaw, of course, the falsification of history, but the Russian memory law actually criminalizes writing and talking about events that actually happened sort of altogether. In any case, according to this historian, Mark Adele, in contrast to what he might call negative nationalists, those people, I probably would be one of those, who want to interrogate and critique the past in order to bring about a better future, right? They tend to be more democratically minded, believing that history is complex and nuanced and wanting, it's a liberal model of history. Putin is a positive nationalist who believes that a monolithic triumphalist narrative is essential to the foundation of a strong, even authoritarian state. So in this sense, he really does seem to be, through history, he seems to be, moving further away from an honest, rigorous engagement with Russia's past, and an unwillingness and being increasingly unwilling to deal with historical complexities. On the contrary, he wants a unified, heroic narrative, particularly about the war, right? The center of gravity, if not the war itself, is likely January 27th. And some of the recent projects, and I can go into these in the Q&A if you want to, some of the more popular projects that are out there for ordinary people to engage with historically bear this out, sort of the heroic narrative, but also with some attention to sort of Holocaust history woven in there. But in the interest of time, I want to move back to his speech and finish it out here. So the speech is interesting in a lot of ways, and I know this is a lot of text, so I'm going to just I'm going to highlight a few points here for you. He really wants to engage his audience. Again, Israeli citizens are there, and other and likely Holocaust survivors. He wants to be empathetic with respect to the Holocaust, and talks about the liberation of Auschwitz and how he's read through the documents and heard the soldiers talking about the pain and indignation, et cetera, that they suffered. But then he pivots to the focus on the Red Army Field Marshal Konev, who led the liberation effort, and gives a full paragraph to sort of heroicizing him. So you can see that pivoting, right? Again, the Jewish experience comes in for a moment, and then quickly he pivots the attention back to the Soviet army as liberators. And this is pretty standard stuff by this time. Further, this is the next section, he goes on to talk about in language that sounds familiar, but he doesn't mean it quite the same way. The Holocaust was a deliberate annihilation of a people, but he's not really talking about the Jewish people specifically, or at least it's very ambiguous, because he immediately switches over to other peoples, including Russians and Belarusians, et cetera. And again, their suffering and their victimization at the hands of Nazis. But then towards in the final paragraph here, back in 1945, it was again the Soviet people who put an end to this and paid an unimaginable price for this. We will never forget this. So he's appropriating the language about not forgetting, but look at what he's not forgetting, right? So it's slippery. It seems familiar. The language is the rhetoric is familiar, but there's a kind of sleight of hand going on. And this is one of those projects that I'm happy to come back to, the Liberators Project, but I'm going to move on. Okay, so back to Putin's speech again. Okay, so, and I'm going to wrap up in just a minute. So another use of the Holocaust for Putin is very clear in the speech as well. The other claim he makes is for a full investigation into Holocaust crimes, something I think most people would agree with. But evidently he sees Russia as relatively safe from blame on this score. More importantly, he understands this as an opportunity to weaken Eastern European states that he wants to continue exerting influence over, including, most importantly, Poland, the Baltics, and Ukraine. Now, this is not a completely new development. I can talk about that later. He's outed the Eastern Europeans as collaborators in the past. But I want to give you an example from Ukraine specifically. Many of you might know that a massive Ukrainian memorial project is now underway in Kiev, which is sponsored in part by Russian oligarchs, most prominently the oil and banking oligarch Mikhail Friedman, who's also of Ukrainian Jewish descent. as I've checked this out, and at least online, there are a lot of historians, Western historians, as well as Russian historians involved in the project, and they've given a full account of the Holocaust, what they plan to do with this project. It seems like a balanced approach to me, at least so far on paper. And Friedman says as much. We're gonna not downplay the collaborators, and neither are we going to ignore those Ukrainians who risked their lives to save Jews. And of course, there were both collaborators and the righteous among the nations. Friedman says we want to show all historical facts, and if that helps Ukrainian society look truth in the eyes, to accept that truth, to process it and draw conclusions from it, and to move forward as a society based on that understanding, then I would be very glad that we helped. And this is in line with former Ukrainian President Poroshenko's 2015 speech at the Knesset, in which he paid tribute to the righteous among nations, those who rescued Jews, but also spoke about collaborationists and even apologized to the children and grandchildren of Holocaust victims and promised that future generations would be raised to reject those crimes. Of course, the broader context here is Ukraine's desire to disengage from the Soviet communist past and to move towards fuller integration with Europe. Now, for his part, current President Zelensky has been supportive of the memorial project. He, of course, is Jewish himself. He says, my position is simple. Anyone who lays a stone in honor of the victims, they have my blessing. But there are many Ukrainians who disagree strongly, including Zelensky's own intelligence chief, who warned the government in a letter last year that this memorial project is part of a Russian plot to discredit Ukraine on the international stage. Oh, sorry, I went forward, but I didn't mean to. Anyway, another skeptic is Yosef Zissels, who's the vice president of the Ukrainian chapter of the World Jewish Congress, who believes that the memorial project is a part of a hybrid war waged through these Russian Jewish oligarchs, especially Friedman, doing Putin's bidding. He says, he doesn't believe that their intentions are all above board. And he points to the timing of the decision to move forward with this project as very suspicious. The first discussions took place in the fall of 2015, when the deadly fighting in eastern Ukraine had settled into a stalemate and Russia started looking for other ways to undermine Ukraine. That was the same timing with the cyber assault against Ukraine's power grid that fall. The real aim of the project, Zissel says, is to weaken Ukraine in the eyes of both its own citizens and its Western allies. Quote, Putin wants the world to see Ukraine as a pariah, as a nation undeserving of statehood, a country of nationalists, anti-Semites, and neo-Nazis. The Russian president has pushed that narrative for years, once describing Ukraine as a country convulsed by a frenzy of neo-Nazism. Is this paranoia justified? Very likely, perhaps, I don't know. But I also think it doesn't really matter, because I think the strategy on Putin's part in any case with respect to Eastern Europe and the Holocaust in particular is less to prove anything particularly than to create doubt and to provoke conflict as a way of weakening the sovereign states that he still wants to exert influence over. A historian, Yelena Subotic, has recently argued in a really good book called Yellow Star, Red Star, that the contested memories of the World War II era in Eastern Europe split as they are between those who focus on victims of fascism and Holocaust versus those who focus on victims of communism, present a really foundational challenge to the EU, whose very legitimacy is tied to the victory over fascism and to Holocaust and human rights remembrance. The new European memory politics that you see in Eastern Europe threatens a unified European narrative and thus threatens to destabilize the Union. More than that, the demand that Eastern European states acknowledge complicity in the Holocaust or with fascism almost inevitably will force Western European states to revisit this question. Not all have fully taken responsibility, as some would argue Germany has. And the search for European states for some sort of national core national identity, forces them beyond World War II into a deeper past to find their legitimacy there. But this raises potentially uncomfortable questions, again, for the Western states about their own colonial pasts, et cetera. Whatever the case, it seems that there's a lot of vulnerability around this issue that has implications for Europe as a whole, and Putin seems to understand that and is trying to capitalize it in Russia's national interest, of course. So the last quote here is sort of a call to join together the five powers, of which, of course, Russia is included, Russia, China, the United States, France, and Britain, into some sort of meeting in order to come up with a strategy for combating all the threats to civilization: anti-Semitism, chauvinism, xenophobia, etc. So it's sort of a call to arms, but it's also almost trying to take Russia back to where the Soviet Union was at the end of the war in terms of leading this charge against the dangers presented by populism and fascism, etc. So far, the meeting has not taken place. In the meantime, the decision to shut down the Memorial organization, which is now an international movement with all sorts of smaller groups throughout Russia, if this stands, at the very least, we know that it sends a very powerful warning to all other Russian NGOs interested in human rights, including those who have been promoting Holocaust remembrance and education. So I will end on that note and stop sharing, and I would be happy to entertain questions or comments. I like comments too. I'm sure there's some collective wisdom out there and some collective knowledge. So, oops, you're muted, Nick.
There we go.
There you
go. Putin doesn't seem to talk much about the treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union in the pre-Russia days, or I mean, Jews didn't have a picnic in the old Soviet Union, and yet he seems to kind of glide on past that to talk about the slaughter of World War II and how Jews were part of the suffering of the Soviet Union, but he doesn't seem to recognize that Jews were already suffering in the Soviet Union, or many of them were.
You mean before the war too?
Before the war.
Yeah, no, as far as I can tell, you're absolutely right. There's Jews for him are mostly a category and an identity. He certainly has some very powerful relationships with leaders of the Jewish community, including the chief rabbi and Friedman. But whenever he's speaking about Jews, it really is very much just a category of identity for him. There's he doesn't humanize the Jewish experience. The closest we see him doing that is in that speech where he sort of brings you to the ground at Auschwitz, and he sees the suffering, and he evokes a little bit of empathy for their experience. But on the other hand, I guess I would say he's leaving that to these Jewish organizations, which he is allowing to exist and to, at least for now, and to promote their own stories, which in some ways is better, right? I mean, it's much better for the Jews to tell their own stories and their own history than to allow Putin to do it. So maybe that's a little bit of a silver lining, that because he's so oblivious, he's not trying to tell their story yet, but might be a stretch.
Who else has a question? Floor is open. Anyone? How do you compare what, well, we are getting more and more, I think, and partly thanks to you. Susanna has her hand up. I'll be with you in a minute. More and more Holocaust education in this country, especially thanks partly to your efforts and the efforts of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, to introduce it in the schools, where a lot of students were just simply not aware of the Holocaust.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are trying our best to promote as much as we can in this country, and it's still not nearly enough. But there is, it's safe to say it's much worse in Russia still. There's a famous case, and I flipped past the picture. I was gonna, in the interest of time, I skipped over it. But there's this famous case of these two twin sisters in, I think it was 2011. 19-year-olds at the time, they're on I don't know whether it was a game show or a talk show or whatever, and they're asked, what is the Holocaust? And they look at each other like somebody's speaking a different language, and then they come up with the brilliant response, is it some kind of wallpaper paste? And this, of course, went viral, and it, among other things, earned the two sisters a free trip to Auschwitz to see what they didn't know, and they were part of a documentary. So I do think there has been a lot of progress, I think, in terms of putting in some of the structure to deliver more education. And I mean, one of the silver linings of the pandemic has actually been that the Holocaust Research and Educational Center has had more access to people online than it ever had before. And it's been able to really capitalize on that. And some of those projects I mentioned, they're working through, through the internet now to reach out to people. But there's still a lot of work to be done, a long way to go.
Susanna Hancock had her hand up. You want to ask a question, Susanna?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Really fascinating, and loved hearing from you quite a bit. So just a question that's possibly slightly tangential, but just in this greater picture of discussion, I'm wondering whether you can talk a little bit about whether there's anything as well in the Yevreyskaya Avtomaya Oblast in Russia today, and the fact that the JAO is still one of two official Jewish entities in the world. Previously,
yeah, Birbijan, I don't know much about the region, although I did dive in a little bit recently, and I don't know anything about, I have to say, quite frankly, I do not know anything about Holocaust memorialization going on there. I would suspect that it is, but I'm afraid I don't know. I know that, yeah, the conditions there are not so great. They're struggling, there's financially struggling and so forth, but I don't know anything about.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because it's the only autonomous
yeah
in Russia.
Yeah,
it has a lot of political clout in the sense of really forcing a lot. We're trying to direct a lot of people there for a while, but its population has dwindled significantly.
Yes.
SSR.
Yeah, and from the very start, it was a typical Stalinist project where on paper it was magnificent and made so much sense, but no resources were really put towards it, and people felt very deceived. And it was a pretty sad.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Just about out of time. Anybody else have a quick question? Otherwise, we will thank Page Herrlinger very much for her appearance tonight, and thank the Rockland Public Library on behalf of the library and the Camden Conference. We would like to thank you very much for giving this talk tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was, I can never say it's fun to talk about the Holocaust, but it was a pleasure to be able to share this with you. So thank you, everyone, and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much.